Welcome to the Memory Scope channel. Be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss out more videos like this one.
Born with a condition that bent her knees backward, Ella Harper, known as the Camel Girl, earned $200 a week performing for W.H. Harris's Nickel Plate Circus in 1886, a salary that opened doors she might never otherwise have found. Among the smoke and ruin of September 11th in New York City, a UPS worker continued delivering packages signs through the streets, an ordinary act of duty carried out inside the most extraordinary and devastating of days. Two men spent 13 days sawing through this ancient sequoia in the Pacific Northwest in 1892, felling a tree that had stood for over 13 centuries and measured 331 feet from root to crown. On the 6th of June, 1944, soldiers of the United States Army's 1st Infantry Division waded from their landing craft on the sands of Omaha Beach, photographed by Coast Guard Chief Photographer Robert F. Sargent in a single frame that would come to define an entire generation's sacrifice. In October of 1963, President John F. Kennedy shared a quiet moment at the White House with his young son, JFK Jr., just weeks before an assassination would end the president's life and alter the course of American history. At 17 years old in 1954, Wilt Chamberlain already stood 7 feet and 1 inch tall, a young man from Philadelphia whose extraordinary frame would carry him through 14 seasons and into the permanent memory of basketball history. Somewhere in the 1940s, a United States Army Air Force second lieutenant paused long enough to capture himself and his girlfriend in a mirror, a small, warm moment of ordinary life tucked inside the vast machinery of a world at war. In the 1920s, a patient sits visibly unhappy in what was then considered modern medical care. A reminder that the confidence of an era's medicine did not always find its way into the comfort of its patients. Felt something worth laughing about in front of a camera in 1910. Their playful exchange preserved long after both men were gone, proof that the impulse to share a joke outlasts almost everything else. Beside an eternal flame, in 1966, a Soviet war veteran marked the anniversary of Victory Day, 21 years after the Soviet Union's triumph over Germany. A man carrying within him the weight of a war that had consumed tens of millions of lives. Captured by the United States Ninth Army on April 3, 1945, 16-year-old Hans-Georg Henke became the face of a collapsing regime, his tears in these photographs speaking more plainly than any official account of a war already lost. During the years of Prohibition, moonshiners fashioned cow-shaped shoes to disguise their footprints across fields and forests, a quiet and inventive defiance of a law that lasted from 1919 to 1933 and proved largely impossible to enforce. Using nothing more than a length of wood to press the shutter, a man photographed himself in 1957, decades before the word selfie existed, because the desire to capture one's own image has never needed modern technology to exist. Found off Israel's northern coast in October 2021, this iron sword stretching just under 4 feet in length is believed to have belonged to a crusader, making passage to the Holy Land around 1100 AD, preserved nearly intact beneath 9 centuries of seawater. A soldier of the 369th Infantry Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters, cradles a puppy he saved somewhere along the Western Front in 1918, a tender image from within a regiment whose members, drawn from across the African diaspora, served with distinction in a war that still refused them full equality at home. Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Leon, cousins of Queen Elizabeth II, were placed in Earlswood Hospital in 1941 that ceased in the falsely 63 edition of Burke's Peerage and remained hidden from public knowledge until 1987, their lives marked by silence and institutional neglect. In Colorado in 1905, horse and rider launched together from a platform into open air, a spectacle that drew crowds and offered a fleeting glimpse of the dangerous entertainments people once gathered in great numbers to witness. At the turn of the 20th century in Belgium, miners packed tightly into a shaft elevator rose from underground after another day of labor, their faces and bodies carrying the particular exhaustion of men who spent their working lives beneath the earth. In 1910, young boys earned their living resetting bowling pins by hand in a Brooklyn alley, a form of labor that would be rendered obsolete in 1936 when factory worker Gottfried Schmidt built the first mechanical pin setter from lampshades and flower pots. Rising above Stockholm in 1890, a single tower bore the weight of approximately 5,500 telephone lines, a marvel of early telecommunications that would be made redundant within 2 decades as underground cables quietly took over the city below. Albert Einstein lectured on the theory of relativity in 1922, his ideas reshaping humanity's understanding of space and time. While somewhere in the front row, at least one member of the audience appears to have found the mathematics rather less exhilarating than the theory. Around 1946 in Kentucky, a child of a coal miner sat in a grade school classroom, one of thousands of children whose early lives were shaped entirely by the rhythms, dangers, and economies of the mines their fathers descended into each day. On July 13, 1962, photographer George Barris captured Marilyn Monroe on the sands of Santa Monica Beach in what would become the last professional photograph ever taken of her, an image made all the more resonant by the knowledge that she would be gone within weeks. In 1925, Hugo Gernsback introduced the isolator, a wooden helmet fitted with an oxygen supply and a narrow reading slit to eliminate all distraction and force the wearer into total concentration. A device that captured something both earnest and deeply strange about the modern mind's search for focus. Hungarian farmers placed their infants in a device called a kati, a rudimentary walker that held the child upright and within reach while the parents worked the land, a practical solution born of necessity that also gave the child a name and a measure of independence. In February of 1916, Winston Churchill stood at Armentières in a trench coat alongside Sinclair, commanding the Royal Scots Fusiliers, a man who had already lived several remarkable lives and had several more still ahead of him when this photograph was taken. By the year 2000, Palm computing had grown so dominant in the emerging personal technology market that its combined valuations surpassed those of Apple, Nvidia, Amazon, and Starbucks together, a fact that now reads as a quiet lesson in how quickly the future can overturn the present. On November 22, 1963, fifth graders at Montrose Elementary in Houston, Texas, received the news that President Kennedy had been shot, their faces capturing in a single, unguarded moment the particular sorrow of a generation learning for the first time that the world could change without warning. In 1945, a man walked along a stretch of railway in Belgrade whose ties had been deliberately destroyed by retreating German forces using a railroad plow known as a Schwellenflug. The landscape behind him bearing the marks of an army determined to leave nothing useful in its wake. A Swedish couple paused in 1905 to be photographed alongside their dog, the three of them arranged with the easy familiarity of people who saw no reason to hide the affection they had for one another, however ordinary the moment might have seemed at the time. Artur Korniev photographed the elephant's foot in 1996. A solidified mass of corium formed beneath the Chernobyl nuclear power plant after the April 1986 disaster. Its extreme radioactivity, meaning that even standing near it for minutes carried a measurable and lasting cost to human health. Before the first episode of Friends had ever aired in 1994, the cast traveled together to Las Vegas, their producer quietly aware, and quietly warning them that this easy anonymity was almost certainly the last such trip they would ever be able to take. In the 19th century, portrait photographers required subjects to sit perfectly still for extended periods, leading mothers to conceal themselves beneath fabric or behind furniture to hold their infants steady while remaining invisible to the camera's long and unforgiving exposure. Around 1900 in Brittany, France, a woman stood at an open hearth making crepes in the traditional manner of her region, her hands moving through a task that had been performed in that same corner of Europe for generations before her and would continue long after. 3 Dutch women arrived at Ellis Island in the 1910s and paused for a photograph during immigration processing, their expressions carrying the careful composure of people standing at the threshold of an entirely new life in an entirely unfamiliar country. On January 15, 1919, a storage tank in Boston burst open and sent a 15-foot wall of molasses tearing through the streets at 35 miles per hour, demolishing buildings and killing 21 people in one of the most unusual industrial disasters in American history. New York City in 1977 existed in a particular state of tension and texture, a city navigating financial crisis and social strain while remaining, as it always had, irreducibly itself, dense and loud and alive in ways that the photographs of that era still manage to convey. Without the white grease paint and small black mustache that made him recognizable to the entire world, Charlie Chaplin in 1916 was simply a young man of 27, his face unadorned and relatively unknown outside, the character he had already begun to make immortal. Armed and watchful, a partisan fighter was photographed during the Axis occupation of Yugoslavia in 1943. One of countless men and women who chose resistance over submission in a country where the cost of that choice was measured in lives taken without trial. Somewhere in Flanders in 1917, an Allied soldier knelt to bandage the paw of a Red Cross working dog, a small act of care between species in the middle of a war that had made tenderness one of the rarest and most necessary things in the world. Inside a Chicago divorce court in 1948, a man knelt before his wife in what the record tells us was an unsuccessful appeal for forgiveness, a moment of private desperation made permanent by a photographer who understood that the courtroom was also a stage for very human grief. In 1963, Heinz Meixner drove through Checkpoint Charlie with his windshield removed, the car low enough without it to clear the border barrier, a precise and improvised act of defiance that carried him, his fiancée, and her mother out of East Germany into the West. In 1922, 18-year-old inventor H. day-walked the streets wearing a radio receiver hidden beneath his top hat, the headphones concealed inside, and the whole apparatus quietly functioning, because some people simply cannot wait for the world to catch up with what they are already imagining. From 1906 to 1957, the Fort Pitt Brewing Company operated in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This 1935 photograph, capturing it in the middle of its long run, a working institution of the city. Unremarkable in the way that enduring things often are until the day they are suddenly gone. Nearly 2,000 years ago, a son in Egypt packed a basket of figs and 25 apples for his father, labeled it carefully with the man's name, and sent along a note asking for a reply. A message preserved on papyrus and now held at the British Library, unchanged by time. In 1925, market trader Alfred Bailey practiced balancing 15 baskets at Covent Garden in London as he prepared for the basket carrying championships. The image capturing a world in which such physical skill was still a form of professional pride worth training for and photographing. In 1912, Danish explorer Agnar Mikkelsen was photographed after surviving 2.5 years stranded in Greenland with fellow explorer Ivar Iverson, the two men having endured isolation, starvation, and hallucination in one of the more quietly harrowing survival stories of the Polar Age. On September 11, 2001, Joanne Capestro, a colleague from the 87th floor of the World Trade Center's North Tower, walked through the dust and debris that followed the collapse of the South Tower. Two survivors making their way through the ruins of a morning that had already changed everything. From an elevated booth in 1968, casino security personnel surveyed the gambling floor of the Mint in downtown Las Vegas, watching over a room where money moved constantly and trust was always weighed against the temptation to take more than one was owed. In the spring of 1956, photographer Gordon Parks captured Atlanta's airport in a moment that preceded the profound changes of the civil rights movement, the image holding within it the particular atmosphere of a southern city still operating under the assumptions of a system about to be challenged. Photographed in March 1942 before her procedure, and again 2 weeks after, this unnamed woman's experience reflected the era's troubling confidence in lobotomy, a surgery developed in 1935 by Portuguese neurologist Antonio Egas Moniz that altered countless lives while offering the medical establishment the reassuring appearance of progress. Soviet female snipers posed for a photograph in 1945, their faces belonging to women who had served throughout a war that placed them at the front in roles most other armies had never considered, their composure in this colorized image carrying the particular weight of earned survival. In the Caucasus region of Dagestan in 1991, photographer Kamil Chutuev captured a couple from the village of Gur wearing traditional sheepskin coats, a portrait that feels timeless against the landscape of a region whose ancient customs had long outlasted every empire that had passed through it.
John
Brown was hanged in Charlestown, West Virginia in 1859, convicted for inciting an armed rebellion of enslaved people at Harper's Ferry. A man whose death was mourned by abolitionists and feared by slaveholders, and whose actions moved the nation several degrees closer to an unavoidable reckoning. Albert Einstein and his wife Elsa were photographed together at their residence in Pasadena, California in 1931. The two of them settled into a shared life that had carried them from Europe through the fame and upheaval that followed the man's transformations of how humanity understood the universe. In 1956, workers drained a canal in Venice, Italy, to clean it, a periodic and necessary ritual in a city built entirely on water. The emptied channel revealing the foundations and accumulated residue of a place that has been navigating its own fragility for more than 1,000 years. In 1910, a Vancouver firefighter leapt from a height into a safety net held by his colleagues below, a training exercise for public demonstration that required both precision from the man falling and absolute trust in the hands of those waiting to catch him. The 6 men who raised the American flag on Iwo Jima in Joe Rosenthal's iconic 1945 photograph are seen here as themselves. Not symbols yet, simply soldiers in the Pacific, their act of planting that flag already on its way to becoming one of the most recognized images of the Second World War. Benjamin, the last confirmed surviving Tasmanian tiger, lived out his final years in captivity and died in 1936, and with him went an entire species, an extinction that arrived not with ceremony or mourning, but with the quiet indifference of a door closing for the last time. In the 1890s, Kitty Tatch and a companion stood on the overhanging rock at Glacier Point in Yosemite, looking out over a valley that the National Park Service would one day work to preserve, their ease at the edge of that extraordinary height suggesting a comfort with wildness that felt entirely natural. In 1924, a dog named Pep was photographed and registered as an inmate after being sentenced to life in prison for the killing of Pennsylvania Governor Gifford Pinchot's cat, a story so singular in the annals of American criminal justice that it has never quite been surpassed for sheer improbability. On Valentine's Day in 1945, a technician of the United States Army's 9th Armored Division paused somewhere in Europe to be photographed with a small French girl, a moment of uncomplicated warmth preserved inside a war that had very little of either to spare. In 1939, Bert Hardy photographed a panda at a zoo appearing to peer through a camera at a young boy on the other side, a perfectly timed image in which the roles of observer and observed were reversed just long enough for a photographer to notice and pressed the shutter. A Nazi rally photographed in color by one of Hitler's personal photographers during the 1930s is a reminder that the machinery of fascism was documented from within as well as from without, the bright clarity of the color image making it no easier to look at and considerably harder to dismiss. In 1952, workers climbed rickety scaffolding during the restoration of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, their precarious positions high above the city, a testament to the long and labor-intensive work of maintaining a structure that had stood for 7 centuries and intended to stand for several more. Albert Einstein died in 1955, leaving behind a body of work that had permanently altered the scientific understanding of space, time, gravity, and the nature of the universe, and a name that had become, in the decades since his discoveries, nearly synonymous with the idea of human genius itself. At the end of each shift in Kimberley, South Africa, in 1954, mine workers passed through an X-ray machine operated by the company to detect any diamonds that might have been concealed on their persons, a surveillance practice that made the end of each day's labor feel like a crossing of a very different kind of border. During the catastrophic flooding of Paris in 1910, a polar bear found itself confined to a waterlogged enclosure in the botanical gardens, the rising Seine having transformed one of the city's most peaceful institutions into a strange and temporary inland sea. In 1908, photographer Roland W. Reed captured an Ojibwe man spearfishing from a canoe in Minnesota, the image documenting a practice of the Ojibwe. People with the careful eye of a man who understood that he was recording a way of life the modern world was already working to erase. Robert McGee was photographed as an adult many years after surviving a scalping attack attributed to Sioux warriors in 1864. When he was just 14 years old, the sole survivor of that encounter, his scarred skull a visible and permanent record of a violent frontier history that marked him for the rest of his life. In 1930, contestants for the Miss Europe title gathered for a photograph, their formal poses and careful dress reflecting the particular standards and expectations that the era placed upon women who entered such competitions, standards that the women themselves rarely had any hand in designing. Around 1880, Félix Bonfils photographed Bedouin women in Jerusalem, his lens turning toward the everyday lives of people whose world was already being watched, mapped, and interpreted by a Western eye that seldom paused to ask what the subjects themselves might have wished to say. During the Apollo 17 mission on December 12, 1972, astronauts repaired the fender of the lunar roving vehicle using 4 maps and a clamp, a field solution improvised 238,000 miles from Earth by men who had learned that on the moon, resourcefulness was not optional. In the 1940s, a young couple settled close together behind the wheel of their car at an American drive-in theater, the large screen filling the windshield with light and the rows of vehicles and around them, full of other people who had also discovered that cinema was better with a roof and a companion. In 1911, a lineman worked high above an intersection in Pratt, Kansas, attending to the telephone lines that were slowly connecting the towns and farms of the American interior to one another, one wire at a time. In the early 1900s, a Crimean Greek woman stood for a portrait in traditional costume in the Tauride province, her clothing reflecting the centuries-old cultural identity of a community whose presence in Crimea predated nearly every political border that would later be drawn across that contested land. Around 1958 in Beijing, citizens gathered at the Summer Palace to scare sparrows during the Four Pests campaign, part of the Great Leap Forward's effort to eliminate the birds, a campaign that succeeded so thoroughly it contributed to an ecological collapse that helped drive the catastrophic Great Chinese Famine. 3 young people rode together in a vehicle along an Ohio road around 1924, their expressions easy and unhurried, in the way of people who were simply going somewhere together on a day when going somewhere together was enough of a reason to remember it. A workplace scene from the 1970s captures the particular atmosphere of that decade's offices. The furniture, the technology, the posture of people accustomed to spending their days in rooms that had been designed for efficiency and furnished, usually, with very little else in mind. Workers known as biological robots cleared radioactive debris from the roof of Chernobyl's number 4 reactor in the aftermath of 1986 disaster. Each man allowed only seconds of exposure before being rotated out. A desperate manual response to a catastrophe that had overwhelmed every automated system sent to address it. In 1987, a 7,600-ton apartment building was moved intact through the streets of Alba Iulia, Romania, to make way for a new boulevard, a feat of Soviet-era engineering that treated the existing built environment not as permanent but as merely inconvenient. In 1946, an American inventor presented a prototype flying car to a public that had been promised repeatedly and with great confidence that the age of personal aerial transport was almost certainly just around the corner, a promise that the following decades would receive and return without completing. In 1985, a newsstand occupied a corner of the subway in Lower Manhattan, its racks full of papers and magazines for the rush of commuters who passed through each day, a small commerce in information that felt, at the time, entirely permanent and entirely ordinary.